Well, welcome to Bases 137, Part 7, and it's about NASA. Oh, have I got a spelling mistake there? Maybe we might talk about that. And we have Bob, who's just turned up, decided it because he wanted to watch some football in London, and a few other important things. And there's a small book there that is now out of print, and consequently that copy is worth millions. And I'm here, and I possibly may say a couple of things once we've got on with things, particularly about the Z in the NASA. But let's, Bob, take it away on Part 7.
Yeah, you had me fooled there, Morris, because when I saw it on your computer, I thought you spelt it wrong. And then, of course, 5 seconds later, it kicked in that it was a pun on words, which I thought was quite good. And so, yeah, this area of research is not one that I intended to. It's not a rabbit hole that I intended to go down. And when I did actually have a look at it, I had my own title for this because I'm a writer primarily rather than a speaker. But I was going to write this up, and my working title is "It's Not Rocket Science," which I thought was quite good. But I like your answer too. So, how this came about is an offshoot of my book last year, and a documentary film I also made, which incidentally is now on YouTube. I did make an hour documentary which tracked all the research I was doing about the commune in Zena where I live. And this documentary is now free to view on YouTube. It's 59 minutes. And if you just Google Zena, Spirit of Place, you can see it. It kind of covers some of the occult research and some of the things about D.H. Lawrence that I went deeply into in the book. So this was the book, Zena, Spirit of Place, which fortunately sold out in hardback, and as Miles alluded to, some dealers bought it, so I think it's now at quite a good price on various eBays and things like that. But I have a paperback edition, so I never actually make any money out of them, but it's just about getting my research out. So the paperback edition is, I think it's 12 quid. So Jack Parsons, NASA, It's Not Rocket Science. This is a really weird story, and how I got interested in it was another offshoot of the research I was doing about the commune during the First World War that was established on the farm where I now live, which involved D.H. Lawrence. Also, as usual, Aleister Crowley, the great beast, the wickedest man in the world, started to figure significantly in a lot of the research I was doing, and a lot of the characters that I was looking at, I found had quite a serious occultic involvement with Crowley. So, during the First World War, Crowley, who was involved with various intelligence agencies as well as being a serious occultist, was actually in New York. And he was supposedly at that time working for the German government, or the German Secret Service, pumping out propaganda, writing a magazine called Fatherland. So no one was really sure who Crowley was working for. He seemed to have worked for all the intelligence agencies and infiltrated a lot of secret societies. So in 1916, he was performing, Crowley, as people probably know, performing lots of rituals, which involve sex magic and of course bringing in interdimensional creatures. And that was one of the big things about a lot of Crowley's Enochian magic. In 1916, he embarked on a series of workings called the Amalantrah working, and Crowley always needed to work through muses. Lots of artists, that I've researched and been involved with, I find this is a kind of common thread. So his muse at that time was a woman called Roddy Minor, good name. All of Crowley's mistresses, or so-called Scarlet Women, all had interesting names. So they were performing sex magic rituals with a view to bringing in entities. So let's just have a look. One of the most fascinating things that I found in this story, which leads on to Jack Parsons and of course NASA, was that this entity that Crowley had summoned in 1916 is called Lamb. Now, he did rituals in New York, and he also spent some time in Montauk, which is highly significant because how I got onto being interested in Montauk is that there was a couple of rumours about Crowley's involvement with where I live in Zennor, in Cornwall, that really I put to one side a couple of years ago. I thought, oh, this is just fanciful. It's like so many rumours about Crowley and other people that you shelve and think, well, I'll have a look at this at some later stage. And both of those rumours I have subsequently investigated. One was the fact that in 1938, there's a very complicated story how he was involved with the Fabians and he summoned up an entity in a cottage above where I live, which was an 8-foot winged Draco reptile. So, there's a lot of talk about that story around Zennor, which is also a big centre of the paranormal and witchcraft. So, I went deeply into that, and then I found out that there was a much bigger story than that, which I've gone into in the book, involving entities, Nazis, the Tibetans, the Dalai Lama. Now, the second rumour, which I kind of instantly dismissed as another kind of fable that goes around, the people that the strange artists and the strange occultists and witches that inhabit my part of Cornwall, was that in 1918, Crowley had performed a ritual which linked up the Menantol, which is a fertility symbol near me on the Zennor Moors, to Montauk. Now, at that time, I didn't know much about Montauk. I think a lot of people will know that Montauk is a very significant place, a naval base that is also, deeply secret, and lots of things have gone on there, including the Montauk experiments that happened after the Second World War. So the idea that there was a portal or a gateway or a ley line energy grid from the Menantol to Montauk, I've subsequently started looking into last year. And the Menantol is also known as the Devil's Eye. It's a circular stone, very ancient, and there's also another stone which is a very phallic stone, so that the actual simple monument, which is kind of Neolithic, it is a very sexually charged symbolic place where people go to perform fertility rituals and other other various things to cure illnesses. So as usual, I tend to put myself in situations personally where I've done research and I find a lot of the things have impacted on me. So a couple of years ago, I actually personally did a fertility ritual at the Menantol, which resulted in 2 pregnancies. So again, I like to have personal experience with these things. Now, Montauk is a very interesting place because Montauk has links to Egypt. Now, the guys, I think Peter Moon and another guy wrote a book called The Pyramids of Montauk. And on Montauk Island, apparently there are hidden 20 meters high pyramids underneath. And there's clearly a link between Montauk and Sirius, and ancient Egypt, and Mars too. So when Crowley wrote a book called The Book of the Law in 1904, this was kind of his real introduction into Thelema religion, and there was links between Egypt and Mars, and these subsequent links are quite profound because the whole concept of Sirius. Now, there's various researchers who believe that Sumeria was where the first alien races settled, and they came from the planet Sirius, which is actually in the constellation of Phoenix. So hence we get Assyrians and Phoenicians. So Sirius is of course the silver star, and that also links up in a very esoteric way with the Illuminati and with Luciferianism. So the thing about Montauk is that there's a native Indian tribe there, and their family name are the Pharaohs. So there's clearly an established link between the pyramids in Egypt, Mars, and Montauk. And also the other thing about Montauk is that Montauk in Tibetan is Mantak, which is clarity and understanding. So it also links into the Tibetan theories about Lam. So when Crowley summoned up this entity, which I'll just go back to. There we on there. You got it. This was actually drawn in 1918, which is quite incredible because apart from being an occultist and various other things, including an espionage agent, Crowley was a very talented artist. And I think this is probably, in my opinion, the first depiction of what we would term the grey. So the egg-shaped head, egg also has symbolism, and of course you can link that into Kubrick's film 2001. So this version of Lamb was actually shown in a gallery in Greenwich Village in 1919. So this isn't some elaborate plot that's been put together or some theory. And it was also used in Helen Blavatsky's book, around that time as well. So this became the emblem, I think, of the Greys. And subsequently, going forward, when Crowley was involved with the OTO, which is the Ordo or Templis Orientis, very significant secret society, which basically was a revision of Bavarian Illuminati. And the OTO was then handed over after Crowley's demise to a guy called Kenneth Grant. And Kenneth Grant pursued a lot of this research, and he discovered a planet which he called Isis. And he then introduced into their occult group, which was the OTO, which Jack Parsons, as we come to later, was very much involved with. And the OTO formed a separate sub-branch called the Cult of Lamb. So this idea that Crowley had summed up this entity through his sex magic rituals in New York and Montauk during the First World War, something that had a great impact on what was to subsequently follow with the rituals that Jack Parsons, who became the poster boy for NASA, really. And also, this incredible story of his involvement with Ron Hubbard, who then became the head of Scientology, and both, it's quite easy to establish, were very much under the influence of Aleister Crowley, and were followers of the Thelemic religious cult, and also heavily involved in black magic, and also both involved with probably the FBI, the CIA, and probably the Paperclip, Operation Paperclip. Crowley was in Montauk Crowley spent the whole of the First World War in New York, and the rumour was that he was, the front story that he was working for the Germans, but Crowley was always a double agent. So although he was pumping out propaganda,
yeah, but who for? Somebody must have been running Crowley to get into all those organisations. Certainly, there must be a bigger mystery behind.
Yeah, it's virtually impossible to know who was running Crowley because most of the information about Crowley has been redacted for very good reasons. Now, the Crowleyites, or what we term the Crowleyites, will be of the opinion that that Crowley was run by his contact with extra terrestrials or alien intelligence.
You're talking Alpha Draconis?
I don't know whether I can specifically say Alpha Draconis. The whole ufology world is not really something that I've gone into, but clearly he had superhuman powers, apart from making himself invisible, infiltrating all secret societies on a level that is just beyond belief. The power he had over politicians, the honey traps he was running, his interest in mesmerism, creating schools of yoga, decoding Enochian magic. I think I've gone into Crowley's various activities in previous chats.
I think the reason for this is that more recent information is showing that Crowley was manifesting these deities, these aliens, which had the capacity to infest into, as a soul, into people, into what we call hybrids. And that comes later.
Yeah, that's very correct. The other thing, Crowley's real speciality, and the one that I'm really interested in, Crowley's occult rituals, which is so complicated, it's very difficult to go into them, was that his use of sex magic, which had a profound effect on the 20th century, and also kind of, in a way, trapped both Jack Parsons and Ron Hubbard and countless other people that followed on, including the likes of Kenneth Anger, Timothy Leary, Michael Aquino, all of whom were followers of the Crowley thelemic cult. So if I want to go on to Jack Parsons, Jack Parsons' real name was Marvel Whiteside Parsons, which again is a great name. A very strange character, deeply significant, and I knew about the fact that he was involved with the development of rocket science, but it was the extent to which he was under the control of Crowley's magic and the Ordo Templis Orientis, and as well as the AA, which is the Silver Star. Now, apart from the Ordo Templis Orientis, which was a secret society, which I have actually gone into a bit on my chats about the communes in Ascona, and which led to Lawrence's commune, which was where the OTO was more established as a template to spread through the world to control communes and to control great minds and intellectual movements. So there was another group called the what's called the AA, which isn't Alcoholics Anonymous. It's called Argentum. I can't remember what the exact terms are, but it's the Order of the Silver Star, and this was actually much more of a development of the Bavarian Illuminati, and Crowley became, in control of the AA as well. Argentum Astrum is what it's called, and this also links to Sirius, because the Order of the Silver Star, believes that there's a sun behind the sun, and that Sirius is the bringer of light, and of course the Sirius links to Sumeria, which links to Egyptian mythology. And the thing about the Silver Star, that it was a deeply secret organisation, and there are people who believe that this was actually I think Crowley believed that this was actually the base for the Illuminati, and at that time Crowley was very much in charge of this organisation, as well as the OTO, which was more of a front to lure people into. So Marvel Parsons, aka Jack Parsons, grew up in Pasadena. I think he was born in 1912. Quite a rich family, and his family also had interesting links. They were quite well to do, and one of his ancestors was in the Skull and Bones. But he had an unfortunate childhood. He was a very sensitive boy, and his parents divorced. And he clearly was a genius. He was a chemist, and then he got deeply involved with the occult, and it's really his links between the occult, bringing in interdimensional entities, and rocket science, as well as the use of sex magic. Now, the thing about a lot of these cults goes back to something like there's an Egyptian goddess called Bast, who I've also looked into, because it links into a bit to what happened with my research into Zenar and Lawrence, which is about blood consciousness and the use of sex in order to use it to summon entities. So by going into almost like a trance-like state, Bast was the goddess of sex, and also Bast was an Egyptian goddess, and was cat worship. And funny enough, another story that I like is that in Montauk itself, the naval base, to this day there's still there's wild cats who are called the Montauk cats, and they lead visitors down into alleys or to underground bases and other areas, and this is kind of another myth that you think actually there's probably a lot to it, because Montauk, Mantak, it also relates to the Tibetan lamb, and the Tibetans also were involved with the Dalai Lama trying to buy the cottage that Crowley performed these rituals in 1938, and to this day there's been links to Tibet through other various things which I've gone into as well, including Bulwer Lytton and David Bowie. But anyway, Parsons, I don't want to go into too many diversions. Parsons grew up, and he clearly had an ability to. He was dyslexic, very sensitive, and he managed at a very early age to be an expert in the development of rocket fuel. And in Pasadena at that time, Southern California was also a hotbed of the increase in. It always has been a centre for cultic activity, and there's a place near Pasadena called Palomar, Mount Palomar, and there was an OTO lodge there. An OTO lodge is a lodge or no, I won't say Freemasonry because Crowley's lodges were much deeper than that, but it was an OTO lodge that was one of many that was set up, and people believe that Palomar or Mount Palomar is one of the sexual chakras of the Earth, which happens to be on the 33rd parallel, and of course 33 degrees Scottish rites. There's lots of occult links that one could go into, but Mount Palomar was actually linked to Pasadena, which was nearby, and they actually built a military or an observatory on Palomar in 1949, I think. So Parsons was involved with going to Palomar, and also lots of native Indian ritual sites in Palomar. So Parsons, how he got involved with the occult, it was pretty much followed his own research into chemistry, because I think he, being a borderline genius, he had a deep grasp of quantum physics, and how the two linked together is really where the interesting story is. So he had a group of friends who were, one of his main friends was a guy called Ed Foreman, who became a lifelong friend, and they formed a group of people called the Suicide Squad. So they did the experiments with rockets, with explosives, and they came to the attention of the naval military intelligence, because clearly, when you get a group of kids, building rockets, at quite a high level, they obviously brought them into their system, and the naval intelligence took an interest in Parsons and his group of friends, and they got into various activities. They were daredevils. Parsons was very charismatic, and but also very troubled, and they blew up. They got expelled from school for blowing up the toilets, and they were performing experiments building rockets out in the desert at Palomar. And one of the interesting things, really weird things, is that during the 1930s, Parsons was studying at Caltech, which was Californian Institute of Technology, and he was given usage of the Guggenheim laboratories, which at that time was quite a thing. And of course, the Guggenheim are one of those rich American, probably Illuminati connected families, and I was interested to see the Guggenheim connection because Peggy Guggenheim was also very deeply involved in promoting the abstract expressionists, which came later. So my interest was that people like Jackson Pollock, that whole movement of anti-art, again was controlled by Guggenheim. She was controlling them, and of course Jackson Pollock met a tragic death in that he was decapitated in a car crash. Going on later into that, this went right through to the 60s with people like Kenneth Anger and Anton LaVey, because Jane Mansfield was another monarch-programmed actress from Hollywood, who was also decapitated in a car crash, and decapitation tended to be quite a common ritual. So the fact that he was given access to the Guggenheim labs, and at that time, even weirder in a way, although not in retrospect, if you look at what happened with Paperclip, is that the young Parsons was having telephone conversations with one of his contemporaries in Nazi Germany called Werner von Braun. Now, Werner von Braun was another brilliant rocket fuel designer, chemist. Subsequently, of course, went on to head up NASA after the war in Operation Paperclip. So the fact that a young Jack Parsons, this kind of, was very much part of the Beat generation as well. I mean, Parsons was very much an early beatnik. He was a very rebellious character, and clearly he came into conflict with the authorities quite a lot. So attempts to control him and bring him into the network. I suspect that's why he was put in touch with Wernher von Braun, and of course the fact that he was also very much under the control of Crowley, which gave the occult side of it, and also probably early on his work was controlled and probably taken. He was used. And then the connection with von Braun is, and of course, it was von Braun that went on to create the rockets that were involved with Saturn V. Landings. So Saturn V is also significant if you want to go down the occult route, because Saturn is Set, and also Satan, and of course 5 is also the Roman numeral. So if you look at 5, you look at something like that, and then of course you get the Freemasonry symbol where you get the inverted fives, and also other interesting stories which, when you look at this and think...
Yeah, that's interesting. They always had Saturn 1, and they went from Saturn 1, and then the second stage, second Saturn to S2, and then the third stage, S4.
Yeah.
They go from a 2 to 4, and then the whole thing's a 5. But they didn't have a 3.
No, I know. I mean, these things just seem like coincidences at the time. But the other thing that amused me is that Crowley was always proposed. It's always difficult to know what about Crowley, because he was such a... the stories are so fantastic. But he claimed that it was him that gave Winston Churchill use of the V sign, which was also, a satanic symbol, and rather than peace, I mean, everything gets inverted with and
also Spock with the 2 fingers.
Yeah.
With the middle.
Yeah. So the whole, suddenly, Saturn V is Wernher von Braun, and Saturn, Satan, you can go down that rabbit hole and endlessly. But Parsons, he, apart from being someone who probably an absolute genius, he was really the maverick of the rocket science game. He also, from a very early age, got involved with the occult, and as a youth, a teenager, he was very influenced by people like Jules Verne, H.G. Wells, of course. H.G. Wells, and another great Fabian predictive programmer. And one of the other people he was influenced by was, which I found interesting, was this guy called Jack Williamson. There's a whole offshoot of what's called sci-fi, science fiction. At that time, it was a version in industry. And Jack Williamson wrote a book called Darker Than You Think. And at that time, of course, when Hubbard comes into the scene, Hubbard was also an eminent pulp fiction writer. So at that time, another strange coincidence is that during the First World War, when Crowley was active in California, he actually went to Hollywood in 1916, and they created an OTO church or lodge literally in Hollywood Hills underneath what became the Hollywood Film Studios. So the connection between the OTO, occultism, and Hollywood is really profound. So there was a lodge there, and it was this lodge that the young Parsons visited later in the 1930s. So Crowley already had a lodge in Hollywood, and at that time, when they started making the early silent movies, which I'm very interested in, because my great uncle was in the freak shows at that time, and also was signed up by Howard Lloyd to appear in silent movies. That's a whole different story. But at that time that Crowley was in Hollywood New York during the First World War, my great uncle was also on the stage with Jack the Giant Killer for several years, touring as well. And the interesting thing about Hollywood at that time is that it was also the introduction really of the whole hallucinogenic agenda, which grew through the century with the likes of Leary and Huxley, which I've also gone into on previous chats. And when I was looking at the silent movies, there was one that Doug Fairbanks was in, and the name he had in this movie was Coke Any Day, which was an inversion of Coke. And I think this was the time when the use of cocaine, peyote, all the hallucinogenic drugs were developing. And when you look at those Keystone Cops movies, they're really like, they're all on speed, or they're all on coke. And this was a world that was also running parallel to the occultism. And from an early age, Parsons got dragged into the hallucinogenic drug scene. So when this book, Darker Than You Think, one of the premises of this was there was a race that was an alien race or an underground race that could shapeshift into animals. And this, of course, is another very common archetype, connected to the E.T. and the...
I have to say that the pose there is very like a prominent photograph of Raquel Welch.
Yeah, yes, that's right.
I mean it's too uncanny to have.
Yeah.
It's just something really there.
Well, as you know, I mean, virtually everything we see in especially Hollywood is predictive programming or it's brainwashing. Or the woman, actually, it does relate to Crowley as well, because the woman is called April Bell, and she very much conforms to the archetype. One of the tenets of Crowley's belief system is that you, through sexuality and through the Scarlet Woman or the goddess, they are emblems of Babylon. So Babylon is manifested through sexual energy, and it was this book where supposedly they were a race that descended from wolves who were conquered by Homo sapiens, but they then certain groups of them were able to go underground and establish communities, and then have the ability to then shapeshift and operate as humans. So really, it's another kind of similar to the story about the reptilians, and this was, of course, very much part of the pulp fiction or the science fiction at that time, with people like Jules Verne, underground cities, H.G. Wells, War of the Worlds between races. So this was all being permeated into 20th century culture. And Jack Parsons, was obviously very much, it became part of his thinking, and it all linked into his desire to get to explore outer space, explore planets, and of course, the scientists or the physicists, of which I'm not, will make links between space-time continuums and occult rituals, which enable one to somehow transcend the space-time continuum. So the rituals that Crowley was doing, including the Amalantra one and the Babylon working that Parsons and Hubbard got involved with, there are people that link those to the ongoing Montauk experiments, which I think is for sure true, and also the Philadelphia experiment. So the Montauk experiments that have been kind of documented, by people like Ewan Cameron, who I had kind of knowledge of through my research into Robert Graves and what happened here with the Tavistock Institute, was very much part of that scene post Second World War in Montauk. And one of the belief systems was that by using sex magic or sex consciousness or blood consciousness, which is what Lawrence tapped into, was a way of accessing other dimensions, and it was kind of, this was one route to it, and by the orgasm was able to transcend the space-time continuum. So then, of course, it got developed and perverted with the sex magic rituals that Crowley developed. That are very elaborate and involved lots of different levels of heterosex, masturbation, anal sex, and childbirth sex. So this was all done through the levels in the OTO, which are 8, 9, 10, 11 levels of ritual, which relates to the Tetragrammaton formula, which I can go into another time because it really is very complicated. But Parsons got involved with this belief, and of course the Montauk belief system was that the Earth goes back to Sumeria, and it goes back to the mystery schools of Greek and Roman times, and the gods is that the Earth is a kind of living entity, and that by sex, you can tap into the blueprint that created the Earth. So the act of whatever you call Big Bang or orgasm, there's all kinds of puns you can make on that. That's the moment when you can actually break the space-time continuum. And I think in Montauk they were using psychic experiments on young boys. Obviously, when they're at puberty is the best time to harness this energy, so that you can actually almost transcend the space-time continuum, and by using this psychic power, you can almost set up a whole mind control program that can mass infiltrate the mass minds in order to lead them to down roads that and this is just one of the channels for it, and it was the channel that Parsons easily slipped into, because if you're a sex addict or any other kind of addict, this is maybe a route that Crowley can bring people in to channel entities, and of course he was a master at this kind of research, so Parsons was also going to the the Gnostic masses at the OTO lodges at quite an early age, and he got involved with a few people who were followers of Thelema. Now, Crowley had agents all over the world, and he had lodges all over the world, and all over the Western world anyway, far more than people realise. So in California, there was like dozens and dozens of these lodges, and to this day, when I was researching the paperclip, I find there's lodges in Austin, Texas, where all of his writings are kept, and there's various offshoots of OTOs that sprang up, and of course this was very attractive to a lot of the wealthy people in California at that time, which became a hotbed of occult lodges. Then go to Charlie Manson and Huxley's and all that thing. But the Pasadena Lodge, which was created by Crowley in 1935, was called the Agape Lodge, and agape also is a Greek word which also connects to deep understanding. And agape, the number of agape is 93, the gematria number, and 93 is also the number of Thelema, which was Crowley's religion that became adopted by people that were in these cults. So the Agape Lodge set up in 1935, around the time that Jack Parsons and his other people he was working with were very active in Pasadena, and it was set up in Pasadena, and it wasn't just Jack Parsons that was going to the Agape Lodge. The Agape Lodge was also frequented by the likes of Aldous Huxley, who I obviously have gone into with regard to the Fabians, a lot of other people. I mean, if you want to check out all the people that went to the Agape Lodge, you find it's pretty much a who's who of quite influential thinkers, academics, scientists, occultists at that time. The trouble is, a lot of the information is kept by the OTO, which is still a working organisation, and they've released certain information, but a lot of it, is kept secret, and it's only available to OTO initiates, so it still remains a secret society. Right, so Jack Parsons was the flawed genius of the rocket science industry, and one of the most common known about him is that he's actually got a crater on the moon named after him called the Parsons Crater, and of course perversely it's on the dark side of the moon, which is an album by Pink Floyd as well, which is another story. So in this photograph, Jack Parsons was clearly identified as someone that should be either controlled, handled, or brought into the system. So he was given access to pursue his research, and at the same time he was leading a double life. So he married a girl. He started dating a girl called Helen Northrup, and Helen Northrup was, I think,
is that of Northrop Industries?
Yes, probably, because a lot of these families, do come from some significant industrial families or military families. So if we can see this photograph, that's Jack Parsons on the right. That's Helen Northrup in the middle, and the guy on the left is about to enter the scene. That's a guy called Wilfred T. Smith. Now,
just to be clear, the guy wearing with the spear.
Yeah, the guy with the spear is Wilfred T. Smith. So Jack Parsons and Helen Northrup, while they were dating, were also, funny enough, met people who introduced them to the Thelema, Church of Thelema that Crowley was running. So there's always these coincidences where suddenly they're befriended by another couple who just said, "You must come to the Gnostic Mass." So clearly, Parsons had proclivities towards occultism from his reading, and Helen Northrup was also interested in Crowley, and at the same time, by going to this mass and attending these meetings, they're interest developed, and I think they both started engaging in sex rituals. And at the Agape Lodge in Pasadena, this was run by a guy called Wilfred T. Smith. Now, Wilfred T. Smith was one of those kind of Englishmen that Crowley used as agents to run his operations. Crowley had been at Cambridge and studied organic chemistry, and Parsons was also fundamentally a chemist. So Parsons and Crowley had a very deep relationship, even though they it might not have been one that manifested in a lot of contact with each other physically, but because Parsons was effectively had no father figure, when he during their life, he would always refer to Crowley as his father, and Crowley took very much a shine to Parsons and identified him as someone who would run the OT Lodge in Agape. So Crowley had already targeted Parsons to take over, to a certain extent, take over a lot of his activities in California. And of course, the military-industrial complex had probably also targeted Parsons to become their version of Werner von Braun. So Parsons, while working at California Institute of Technology and doing research at the Guggenheim, was also going to occult meetings and developing his friendship with Helen Northrup. And the guy that was in charge of this lodge was Wilfred T. Smith. That's the guy on the left with the spear. So Wilfred T. Smith was Crowley's agent, and he'd come down from Vancouver. He was Crowley's representative in Pasadena to run this lodge. He was a kind of typical charming Englishman, who a lot of the Americans would consider, as having some intellectual gravitas. So he clearly infiltrated the life of Jack Parsons and Helen, and he then they were regularly involved in sex magic rituals, and subsequently Wilfred T. Smith, much later, Crowley blamed Wilfred T. Smith for to a certain extent perverting Parsons, because Parsons at that time was living in South Orange Boulevard in a house called the Parsonage. He was actually getting funded quite well from the Caltech, and he was given access to funds which enabled him to pursue his research, but at the same time he was obsessively developing his own ideas about rocket science, and he was borrowing money from Helen Northrup's family. I mean, as you mentioned, I think she was from a well-to-do family, so he was constantly getting in debt. At the same time as pursuing his research, he was also coming under the investigation by the FBI because the sex rituals and the drug taking, he was taking peyote, which is mescaline, cocaine, hashish, and getting into altered states of consciousness, and by transcending your logical mind, and another theory about Crowley sex magic and hallucinogenics, which developed in the 20th century, that you could break the time-space continuum and also summon entities. So Wilfred T. Smith, I think, was in charge of this little triangle, and of course then he started sleeping with I think Helen Northrup, Jack Parsons' young wife, came under the influence of and had a relationship with Wilfred T. Smith, which actually developed, and they spent most of their life as a kind of dysfunctional couple, along with other people as well. In the meantime, this is where the research I came into it, because I'm quite interested in scandal. So I like to delve into these people's lives, and I love all the salacious stuff about them. Which is partly why I got so interested in people like Lawrence and Frieda von Richthofen, and of course Crowley's love life is something to behold. So Helen Northrop had a young sister who was 17 called Sarah, or aka Betty, and when Helen Northrop was away, Parsons was sleeping with her young sister, and her young sister Crowley said that she was an absolute vampire, and she started wearing her older sister's clothes, and she declared herself to be Jack Parsons' new wife. So, it's quite a seedy scene. And Jack Parsons later said that by the sexual intrigue that he got involved with Wilfred T. Smith, with his wife, with her young sister, advanced his understanding of Thelemic religion, because the whole incestuous thing as well gave him another edge. So Parsons was going very down dark paths with his sexual and hallucinogenic drug addiction, and I think they made a film not so long ago about Parsons' life called The Dark Angel. So to a certain extent, he was a combination of innocence, but also, clearly got sucked into the world of depravity. So when Sarah moved in, she became his priestess. So his Helen, his first girlfriend, I don't think they were married actually. His first girlfriend were performing, sex rituals which involved chanting, summoning demons, and she was replaced by her young sister. So they carried on doing what's called the first Babylon workings. So Parsons would be taking advice from Crowley via Wilfred T. Smith, and Wilfred T. Smith is documented in OTO research, which it's recently been made more available, that he declared that Jack Parsons was going to be very useful to their cause. And Crowley had also declared that he thought Parsons was a remarkable man and was fit to take over the Pasadena Lodge and become quite a high up figure, or I won't say wizard, in the OTO movement. So clearly they were manipulating Parsons. And let's move on to the next picture. So this is Wilfred T. Smith. As you can see, at that time he was also, I think, Cambridge, and probably involved with the Fabian movement. There was an awful lot of interest in Eastern mysticism, which is again another huge agenda which started at the turn of the century and was promulgated by people like Helena Blavatsky and the Golden Dawn, and then later subsequently by Aldous Huxley and Timothy Leary, Tibetan Book of the Dead. That's a whole massive agenda which more or less formed the basis of the 20th century counterculture movement. So they were performing various rites of the Kabbalah, Eastern mysticism, Enochian magic, of which Crowley believed that he was, he's one of the few people who could decode Enochian magic, and it's very difficult to deny that he did have incredible talents. Also, there's links back to Sumer, because there's a tribe called the Yazidis, which go back, I think, to Sumeria, and the head of this, or the god, the arch-god or demigod of this tribe was Yezid, and their nickname was the Shepherds, and Crowley believed that he was the reincarnation of Yezid. He also believed that he was the reincarnation of Edward Kelly, of John Dee, of Genghis Khan, and King Charles I, and various other worldly entities. So his involvement with summoning entities went back to 1904, when he did a Cairo working, when he summoned an entity called Iwas. And Iwas was an interdimensional entity that enabled him to introduce his concept of the Aeon of Horus, which was how the 20th century would be programmed, and it's to do with Osiris, Horus, again very deeply into Egyptian mythology, but very significant. So Wilfred T. Smith was the thing about Crowley's lodges and covens, and they all seem to go wrong. I guess that the sex and the drugs, created a very unstable environment. But a coven he was running in Newlyn, which I explored last year, in the 30s, actually around the same time, 1938, he was running a coven in Newlyn that I investigated, and that was run by a guy called Major Robin Thine, who was purported to be from the Thine family, Marquis of Bath, a very occultic family going back to Elizabethan times, and John Thine was another one of Queen Elizabeth's magicians. So, you know, he gets these guys in charge who are ostensibly aristocratic, cultured Englishmen, and I think they do have a lot of sway. But subsequently, he wanted to dismiss Wilfrid T. Smith because he blamed Smith for perverting the plans that he had for Jack Parsons. So whatever, you know, Crowley was involved with, he did have a very serious plan for the development of his own Thelemic religion through the OTO. But obviously the dangerous use of sex magic and getting people hooked on hallucinogenic drugs really just causes lots and lots of chaos, which is also part of the agenda to do with the Aeon of Horus. So he planned to replace Wilfrid Smith with Jack Parsons. So at that time, Crowley had, how he became head of the OTO, I think I've gone into in previous chats about how it was founded at this commune in Ascona, and it was the rebirth in a way of the old defunct Bavarian secret society, which formed the Bavarian Illuminati. So the Ordo Temporis Orientis combined a lot of Egyptian mythology with gematria and with Eastern mysticism and also Freemasonry. So basically he cobbled a whole new concept, a whole new religion that was going to be the religion of the 20th century, which was called Thelema. And of course this had very complicated implications, because part of the Thelemic belief system was the worship of the Baphomet god, which was a representative of Pan, and also a representative of Babylon. So Baphomet was also the androgynous god, and this relates to the work of Eliphas Levi and the Solve Caragula symbol, which became one of the tenets of Thelemic sex magic. So Solve Caragula is like the fusion, the creation of a new fusing, the male and the female, and that goes into the androgynous program. So at that time, Crowley, apart from calling himself 666, the Great Beast, also called himself Baphomet, and it's to do with various forms of sex magic that fuse the. It was fundamentally based on the solar phallic concept, but the solar phallic concept was about fusing Pan and Babylon. And in that book that we saw earlier, that Jack Parsons had been influenced by, the character there, that female, that flame-haired temptress character, was a significant symbol that reappears through Crowley's work, and also lots of other people's work, in the sense that this is the emblem of Babylon. So the beautiful witch or the muse that Crowley would use to summon, and often he would use them as his muses. And then Parsons, of course, then developed that theme, and he would use firstly Helen, his first girlfriend, and then Sarah as his muse, his goddess, and of course then his most important fundamental muse was about to enter the scene, and that was a woman called Marjorie Cameron, who I became very interested in, and the Babylon workings, the first part of the Babylon workings, were taken part in 1946 in January, and they involved rituals with Sarah, but they weren't really working. He didn't feel that he was bringing in entities, so they would be having like 11-day sex rituals, listening to Prokofiev and taking hallucinogenic drugs with a view to bringing in what's called a moon child, which is an entity that's created on the astral plane. So a lot of this goes back to Crowley's various books, various documents. So, the Book of the Law, the Book of Thelema. So they would be performing sex rituals, and Crowley would be overseeing these rituals, so that it also sounds very voyeuristic, of course, and Wilfred T. Smith would also be overseeing these rituals. So Wilfred T. Smith was having sexual relations with probably with Parsons as well, because there's very strong evidence that Parsons was bisexual, and that was involved with much more perverse activities, which in a way compromised his position as this rocket scientist, which is another straight out the Crowley playbook, in the sense that people get compromised because while they were living in this what's called the parsonage in Pasadena, Parsons got so involved with this world that he would take in house guests, but they had to be occultists. So, a commune developed in this house which Wilfred T. Smith had moved in, and this is another familiar pattern, is that communes develop preferably among quite wealthy people. And apart from the drug taking and the constant orgies, Parsons had a room where he used to perform his sex rituals with Sarah Northrup. And there was an altar, there was a big picture of Crowley on the wall, and he also used, there was talk at the time that quite a lot of scandal arose in this posh part of Pasadena, because people were coming and going. There was a story that a young boy was sodomized brutally, and that another pregnant woman was seen going through various sex rituals in the garden. So there was a constant stream of people coming and going during the night, and of course Parsons was running his day job, but in Caltech, although he never was one for a 9 to 5, and then they recognised he was a genius, so he was given quite carte blanche to pursue his own research. But at the same time, the FBI were getting very concerned about his activities, and of course this was drawing a lot of attention. And it subsequently came to light that after Parsons' death, which is a very strange and curious death, there was a FBI file of about 100 pages long on Parsons' activity in Pasadena, with this OTO lodge. And of course at that time Herbert Hoover was running the FBI, and Herbert Hoover's nickname was Mary, because he liked to wear women's frocks. So you can see the kind of the world that was going on with the FBI, the CIA, the level of child perversion of drug taking, of possible child trafficking, of paedophilia. It was also very rife at that time, as it was in the English establishment. So there's no surprise there. Now, enter the scene. I mean, this again is an incredible story. Ron Hubbard, I think most people know Ron Hubbard is the creator of Scientology, and he then enters into this mad world of Jack Parsons being run by under the influence of Aleister Crowley's sex magic. And Parsons claims that he was also a very successful pulp fiction writer. Really one of part of that whole belief system to do with alien races, shape-shifting. This was the theme of a lot of his work. He also was in naval intelligence, no surprise, and during the war he came out with a lot of stories after the war that how he'd been had different identities. Another very charismatic, charming con man, and he also subsequently entered into this scene, whether he was brought in by Wilfred T. Smith or by Crowley. It's uncertain, because Hubbard had claimed that he'd had prior knowledge and had indulged in Crowley's Thelemic religion, way before he got involved with the Agape Lodge in Pasadena. So he had a deep interest in gematria and Rosicrucianism. So he also comes from a very well-established occult Gurmid background. So he seamlessly moved into this scene, and it seems that him and I think Parsons became a bit obsessed with Ron Hubbard, and it looks so they probably had some kind of weird sexual relationship as well. So Hubbard moved into the house or the parsonage in South Orange Grove. So you've got Jack Parsons following all the being instructed by Crowley in how to summon entities and how to develop himself as a thelemic wizard. And now Ron Hubbard, who then became, of course, a very significant Scientologist, and I think that's a whole different story. If you look at what happened with Scientology in Hollywood and the likes of Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman, and I've got more information on all that, which is mind blowing. Hubbard's moved into the scene, and he's now taking part in these sex rituals. So they started doing the Babylon workings, and they were going out to the Mojave Desert, and Hubbard seemed to like con everybody that was in this commune. Everyone's kind of fell under his spell to a certain extent, and he then started sleeping with Sarah Northrop. So poor old Jack Parsons didn't have much luck with his women, because the first one ran off with Wilfred T. Smith, Crowley's agent, and the second one then teamed up with Ron Hubbard, and I think this left Parsons in a he was always in a very fragile mental state, and of course his drug taking increased, and his desire to create what's called Babylon, summon the horror of Babylon, increased. So he then, what happened was, which was really seedy, is that Hubbard became the scryer, and Hubbard was filming their sexual activity with a view to also having electronic equipment to hear tap into any voices that came from the astral plane. So they were performing, and at that time, I think when Helen Northrop went off with Hubbard, they kind of disappeared for a while, but they came back, and then she'd switched to being with Hubbard, and Parsons was involved in doing what's 8th degree sex magic, which was basically masturbation. So you got this kind of scene where Hubbard is documenting Parsons masturbating, and apparently this 8th degree of the tetragrammaton sex magic that Crowley had formulated was that by prolonged masturbation and not releasing the sperm or the life force or the kundalini, it was another way of accessing an interdimensional creature. So you can imagine what was going on, and how the FBI were kind of looking at this, because word was getting around, and it subsequently came to light that when Hubbard was covering his tracks, he claimed I think in 1969 that he was an agent of the FBI, and he was sent into the Agape Lodge to discover what was going on, because another guy in this Agape Lodge was a guy called Robert Heinlein, who was also another science fiction writer, and his dystopian work was about how you can destroy spirituality by creating a dystopian world that is completely run by machines. So the FBI clearly were involved, and Hubbard was also extremely disreputable, because it transpired that him and Sarah Northrop conned Parsons out of a lot of money. They formed an enterprise called Allied Industries, and they used a lot of the money that Parsons was making to buy yachts and then sell them. So at the time, a high percentage of Parsons' money was also going to Aleister Crowley, who was aging and in back in England at that time. Like the last couple of years of his death, he was getting a percentage of all the money that was being channeled through the various OTO lodges. Crowley was always on the lookout for business, and he was selling his own sperm, called the elixir of rejuvenation, and a lot of the aim was to create the Whore of Babylon, and the Whore of Babylon was an entity that was summoned to do with the Inn of Horus, and of course subsequently with Kenneth Anger, he wrote 2 fabulous books called Hollywood Babylon. So Babylon almost became a representation or an archetype of not only Hollywood, but also of the United States, and also the sexuality. So the red-headed woman on that book was a typical example of the Whore of Babylon. So Hubbard ran off with Parsons' money. Parsons, just was carrying on his own research obsessively, and he asked Crowley for help, and so Crowley and Wilfred Smith summoned an entity called Barzabal, which was an entity connected to Mars, and then it transpired that the yachts that Hubbard and Northrop were running were wrecked in a storm. So again they've summoned entities to affect happenings here. And Parsons at that time became obsessed with finding a new. He needed a new muse, and he needed to summon Babylon. So at that time, he was still going into the prior to Harvard running off. They were still going into the Mojave Desert, and they commenced what was called the Babylon 2 workings, and these were done in a couple of months later in 1946. And again, it was going out into the Mojave Desert, and Parsons had what we would call a moment of illumination, and he was convinced that they'd managed to summon the Whore of Babylon, and this connects to summoning an entity on the astral plane. So he went back to his house in Pasadena, and at the exact time he did feel as though that he'd made some kind of great illumination. And at that time, this woman, a woman called Marjorie Cameron, fortuitously was knocking on the door of the Agape Lodge, and she then became Parsons's muse, Parsons's witch, and really became a significant part of the Babylon 2 workings. So she then became, the goddess. That they engaged in massive sexual rituals. She was a really interesting woman. She had an unfortunate childhood. She was very sexual promiscuous from a very early age, and in fact, her mother performed an illegal abortion on her when she was a teenager. She was an artist and occultist. Already had a profound knowledge of Crowley's work. Was under the influence of Crowley's Thelemic belief systems, and then enters into the Agape Lodge and becomes Parsons's squire to a certain extent. Now, what's interesting is that they were using, one of the techniques they were using was Enochian magic, which is a form of angelic language developed by John Dee, Elizabeth I's astrologer and magician, and his squire Edward Kelly. At that time in the 16th century, they were also involved in necrophilia, with drug taking, with astrology, and it was much more commonplace in those days for magicians to be part of the court. But what happened was that Edward Kelly ran off with the woman with John Dee's wife, and also ran off with all of his money. So this kind of little triangle was replicated by Hubbard and Sarah Northrop and Parsons. So they were reenacting Enochian magic under the advice of Crowley, because Crowley was one of the only people that really that could use these Enochian keys, and these Enochian keys were what was used to unlock portals or dimensions. And in order to unlock a portal, you had to follow very strict rules, and it was believed by Crowley that both Parsons and Hubbard had got way out of their depth when were doing things that really without beyond his jurisdiction, and he called them a pair of idiots, and he started to get very concerned that they'd opened a portal that they couldn't close, and which seems to be the case, because between the Babylon 1 and the Babylon 2 workings in the Mojave Desert, what happened was that that was the start of all the UFO sightings. I think the first ones were called the ghost ships over Scandinavia, and then you had the Roswell incidents, which came later. But suddenly it was almost as if floods of unidentified objects were seen. It was also the time when 1947 Israel was founded, the CIA was founded, Operation Paperclip was up and running, and Kenneth Grant, who took over the OTO from Crowley when Crowley died, believed that the Amalantrah working in 1918, which had summoned in the entity of Lamb, was where the Greys came in, and that he then believed that Hubbard and Parsons hadn't closed this portal correctly. So Crowley was furious, and he actually he abandoned the pair of them. He thought Hubbard was a complete con man. He thought, probably rightly, that Parsons had firstly been under the control of Wilfred T. Smith, who was depraved, and then of Hubbard, who. So he just said that Parsons was going to go to the devil in his own way, and that he didn't want anything more to do with them, and that he regretted that he could ever take over his jurisdiction of the OTO. Yeah, Marjorie Cameron is a figure that interests me. As an artist, my main interest is that I come in at this from an artistic point of view, and she was a very talented artist, as well as being an occultist, as well as being really the most significant woman in Jack Parsons' life. And she embodies a lot of those characteristics that the likes of Crowley, Parsons, in terms of being the whore of Babylon. I mean, she used to drive around in a hearse in Los Angeles. She had long black fingernails, red hair, a bit like the woman on the cover of that book. Also, she kind of embodies a certain look that became very, very much the vogue in Hollywood movies. The likes of, I think she looks a little bit like Lauren Bacall and Raquel Welch. So, Marjorie Cameron. She it turned out to be, apart from being a very volatile woman with a lot of emotional problems, she turned out to be a very loyal towards Jack Parsons. And when Jack Parsons' life kind of spiraled out of control to a certain extent, she had her own agenda. And as an artist, she worked with a lot of mediums, but her work was a combination of Crowley occultism, to do with alien shape-shifting interdimensional beings, combined with French surrealism. So, a very interesting artist, and she became very much part of the Beat generation. She survived Parsons' death and all that went on in the 1940s to develop a good artistic career that went right on into the 60s. And she. When Parsons, she left Parsons, but came back to him, and when she left Parsons, she claimed to have been pregnant and to have had a moonchild. Now, moonchild is also another significant concept in this. Part of the plans in order to raise an interdimensional creature, or to bring in a new eon, or the eon of Horus. And Crowley wrote a book in 1917 called Moonchild, which was only subsequently published in 1929. And Moonchild was based on a lot of his idea belief systems in that you can create a child on the astral plane. That is a significant factor. So a lot of these rituals were to do with one of the rituals in his thelemic sex magic was a procreation ritual. So she claimed to have had a moonchild, and then clearly, she's not really a reliable witness, because she was very brilliant, but also mentally unstable. And then she came back, and then she declared that she was actually the whore of Babylon, and that she was Babylon. Parsons later declared that he was actually the Great Beast, and he was going to replace Crowley as the Great Beast. Ron Hubbard later claimed that he was actually Crowley's natural replacement, and that Parsons wrote a book. Not many people know that apart from Parsons' scientific work, which I'm not really equipped to go into, with regards to rocket science and things like that, but he also had a huge output, which has somehow been buried under the carpet. He wrote a book called The Babylon Workings. He transcribed a lot of his trance states when he was doing the sex magic rituals. He translated the voice recordings into Liber, I think it was Liber 49. That also relates to a lot of early works by Crowley. So he actually wrote books, and he declared himself to be Crowley's replacement, and they all, for the rest of their lives, were dedicated to carry on the thelemic philosophy. But again, a lot of that is not necessarily things that have been highlighted upon. So Marjorie Cameron believed that she had a moonchild. Now, this novel, Moonchild, is a very significant novel because it was actually it's about the manifestation of a new age, or a new dawn, or a new form of human being, which, you know, born on the astral plane. Clearly, there's some connection between other worlds, other planets, and funnily enough, one of the other interesting things that I like to pick up on is that when this child was manifested in the novel Moonchild, which was a working that was repeated, the house that this took place in was called the Butterfly Villa, and of course, you know, at that time, Vladimir Nabokov, good writer who wrote Lolita, it links in again to the paedophilia agenda, and the fact that you know, the butterfly then became a symbol of the Monarch program, which was a very you know, a very dark and important program that the CIA were running to brainwash actresses and actors into the counterculture and the media. So the fact that you know, that there's a connection there, and Marjorie then carried on, and she did become really an icon of the Southern California movement. This is her painting of Jack Parsons. And now, Jack Parsons met a very unfortunate end at an early age, 37, I think. At that time, his life had spiraled out of control with his dabbling with the occult. Crowley had literally cast him off. Crowley saw him as taking his own place, and although he was a significant factor in you know, Jet Propulsion Laboratory, which was the embryo of NASA, was actually basically, you know, it was a one-man band initially that they set up to use the research of Jack Parsons, and of course the joke was that what it really meant was Jack Parsons' laboratory. So, you know, a deeply important man at that first half of the 20th century, but, you know, it all went wrong, as it invariably did with anyone who got involved with Crowley's rituals, in the sense that he was, I think, due to the sexual practices that were being uncovered and what he was involved with, there was the suspicion by the FBI that he could easily be infiltrated by the communists. And at that time, there was the paranoia about the communists, you know, McCarthyism, and so the suspicion was that he was giving secrets, and he was actually approached by the Israeli government to develop a rocket propulsion system for them in I think it was 1947. At that time, he'd been defunded by what became, you know, the military-industrial complex. You know, couldn't trust him. They thought that his drug taking, his sexual corruption, would lead to him being compromised. And this is another classic thing out of the Crowley playbook that also was later used by, you know, people like Robert Maxwell, and then we all know about, there's a similar theme with Epstein, and how an occultist, a magician, can infiltrate high society and politics, and in order to get control of the significant players. So he was pretty much cast adrift. So he had to take quite menial jobs, and he took a job, ironically, working for a Hollywood film studio, you know, being their expert on explosives. So he would advise them when they were using explosives for various films, like, you know, a lot of this was going on in the silent movies. He was their technician. He's also working for Howard Hughes Aircraft Company. Howard Hughes was another quite a significant figure at this time. He was a recluse. He was also connected to Nikola Tesla, and so he was doing these menial jobs. At the same time, he sold his manor house in Pasadena, sold and kept a part of the building, an annex of the building, which was his laboratory, and still on and off with Marjorie Cameron. They were planning to go to Mexico. They really were then fully invested in Thelema, and he wanted to go to Mexico to develop the work of Aleister Crowley, even though Crowley had enough of Parsons, and just said that he'd gone down the wrong path, and that him and Hubbard hadn't closed this portal, and that this was going to cause a lot of chaos. But Parsons nevertheless persevered and planned to go and set up a university or a college of Thelema in Mexico. He was also being tracked by the FBI at this time. Marjorie Cameron was making her own artwork, and one of the artwork she did was this painting of Jack Parsons, which more or less shows him with the bat wings and the cloven hooves, and again you get symbols of Pan and the whole occultism to do with Horus and Baphomet and Babylon is all connected to Pan worship, which goes back a long way. So what happened was that Parsons was really unfortunate because I think he was taken out by the FBI, and Marjorie Cameron was convinced that he was murdered because of what he knew, and there were suspicions that he might have gone to, because he was I won't say he was left-leaning, but he was in part of that bohemian crowd that were attracted to communism, and Parsons was kind of flirting with communism at that time, as a lot of that radical generation, including the Beat generation, were. So he was kind of very much an early beatnik, and he became a bit of a symbol for that cause, in the sense that this was a guy who was like working in the military industrial complex, an absolute flawed genius, but at the same time was hanging out with drug takers. He was involved with black magic, with occultism, and the whole Crowley mythology. Subsequently found out that he was very much influenced by that. So he was doing an experiment in his lab, and the official story was that he mishandled some mercury, which is highly unlikely given his skill set. Although he had blown up his toilets before, but of course he was explosives went off. He lost half his face, and he was taken away and put in hospital. Marjorie Cameron was refused permission to see him. He didn't survive. And she was the body somehow was never shown. Either he was taken out or given a new identity. So Marjorie Cameron spent the rest of her life more or less as a tribute to both Jack Parsons, and was also determined herself to become the whore of Babylon that Crowley that they tried to manifest through Crowley's sex rituals. So she then developed a quite remarkable career. She was troubled because she used to go into the Mojave Desert and do her own rituals, where she would slash her wrists and try to connect with Parsons on the astral plane. And again, after Parsons' death, and after at that time in 1947, actually before Parsons' death, she went to Paris to try and came to Europe to meet Crowley. Crowley had died in 1947, and this was also at that stage when people that took over Crowley's work, including Kenneth Grant and Carl Kramer, who were linked to the Bavarian form of the OTO, believed that he had open portals, and that this was connected to Roswell, and also the Montauk and the Philadelphia experiment, where time and space, that whole connection has been the fabric has been torn in that curtain. So just this photo of one of Marjorie Cameron's works is, again, I think you were saying, Miles, that this is the rape of the human by an alien. It's called peyote vision, and of course, peyote was pretty much their drug of choice.
Yeah, it's demonologists.
Demonologists, yeah. So
they imprint and infuse their essence into you at the last minute. They take their mask off, and that's how you can have two heartbeats. And this brings us into Doctor Who. Doctor Who having two heartbeats.
Yeah.
The only other entity, and James I did research on this. Seems to be an odd coincidence that you might have Doctor Who and the BBC, two heartbeats, infusing a demonic entity, shape-shifting into different characters. All of the BBC seems to have a odd connection with that picture.
Yeah, odd but not surprising given what we know about prescriptive programming. But yes,
Exactly.
Marjorie, the story about Marjorie Cameron didn't end there. She spent her life, really, really trying to pursue this work. She actually created her own cult, which involved bringing people of different races together, children of different races together, in order to create a new race. And part of her fantasy or her agenda was that a new race was going to be born of moon children, and that it linked into.
I have to say, Max Spear's Moon Children.
Max Spear's what?
And Max Spear's something to do with that. Moonchild. Tim Refat mentioned it with Duncan Davis.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me because the whole Moonchild concept, is very much linked into the age of Aquarius. And what happened with Marjorie Cameron is that she believed that she was the whore of Babylon, and she predicted her work became increasingly apocalyptic. I think she was a really fine artist, but her work became really apocalyptic, and that picture that we just saw was actually exhibited in 1957 in a gallery called I think it was the Freeless Gallery in New York. The whole show was immediately banned and was labelled depraved, and so she was very much working in that underground movement. She became a bit of a cult figure, and what's really interesting to me is that she then became one of the kind of what's called a Hollywood witch. In her elder life, had this commune, and she believed that aliens were going to come, and that her and her followers would be transported to Mars, and that the new Eon would be apocalyptic. And
Are you talking? Did you mention Elon there?
The new Eon.
It sounded like Elon Musk.
The
and
Eon
Mars.
is like the new age. I mean, that links into the Eon of horror. So the whole Babylon thing links into the manifestation of the Eon of Horus, which is connected to order out of chaos. The new world. The order out of chaos thing is very much connected to Luciferian and Thelemic systems. So Marjorie Cameron eventually was diagnosed with a brain tumour, and I think she had a Thelemic ritual death in the Mojave Desert. But prior to that, she had become very influential, and she was picked up. There's a guy called Kenneth Anger, who I've spoken about before, who's a Hollywood underground filmmaker, made really interesting films, including a film called Lucifer Rising, in which he wanted to get Mick Jagger to play that part. And Kenneth Anger also believed that he was carrying on the work of Aleister Crowley. Anger had Lucifer tattooed all over his chest. He became another part of these communes in Southern California that spread up in the wake of Crowley's. When Crowley died, it didn't stop there. It just kind of mushroomed all over the place. And it was Marjorie Cameron that introduced Kenneth Anger to the work of Crowley, because apart from being an artist, Marjorie Cameron was, as Jack Parsons and Ron Hubbard were, they were extremely well versed in these rituals and the Rosicrucian belief systems and the Egyptian mystic schools and Greek and Romans. Gematria. They were deeply. It wasn't just something they picked up and as a hobby. They were deeply immersed in it. And she taught Kenneth Anger all about Crowley. He made a film called The Inauguration of the Pleasure Dome, which Marjorie Cameron starred. And again, this was part of that whole witchy scene in California that developed, which then spread to things like Rosemary's Baby and Eyes Wide Shut. And this whole was very significant.
And you got a Barbara Bush connection there.
Yeah,
well, that's another subject.
Talk about Barbara Bush next time, and the Bushes and Paperclip. Then it gets a very, very, very intriguing story. But to wrap it up, Kenneth Anger then introduced Anton LaVey, who was involved with the Church of Set. And of course, Set, is connected to Saturn, and again, going back to Syria, there's a lot of connections between between that. So
And Michael Aquino.
yeah, well then Michael Aquino was another one in in that procession of people that were developing the work of Aleister Crowley, as was Timothy Leary. So again, Marjorie Cameron was really the conduit between the work she did with Jack Parsons, under the instruction of Crowley, through to Kenneth Anger. So she became a bit of an underground cult figure, and so then we're going into the 60s and the 70s, which is an area where again I've picked up a lot of research, and just the other day I was actually thinking, I was reading something about, which I'm not going to go too deeply into now, about Jimmy Savile. Now, of course, Crowley's influence on the counterculture is just like, it's unfathomable when you go into it, and it turns out that of course Jimmy Savile was a very deep follower of Thelema, and also saw himself as carrying on the work of Aleister Crowley. So when Jimmy Savile was doing his marathons, he would wear a shirt with 666 on. He had he performed a lot of dark masses. He had a gown with the 11 starred symbol that was Crowley's 11 star. 11 was a Thelemic number. It was a combination of the pentagram and the hexagram. Now Savile also, when you look at his writings, and he talked about being a miner. He used to read occult books, with a miner's lamp when he was young. He was involved in the late 40s. He was involved with the youth dance movement. So it's not so long between the likes of Parsons in 46, 47. Parsons died in 52, but at that time Savile was effectively carrying on the Thelemic rituals here, and he really, you can go down the route where Savile was in MI5. Savile was working for Mossad as well. He had deep links to Zionism. Also, he had an incredible, in a way, he had a similar power in the sense that he was above the law. And of course, part of Crowley's thesis was that, the book of the law, i.e. the individual, is above the law. So his mantra, "Do what thou wilt, shall be the whole of the law," was obviously picked up by a lot of other people. And this briefly goes back to a German philosopher called Schopenhauer, who in 1812 wrote "The World as Will as Representation." And the tenet of Thelema religion or philosophy is that you enact your will, and if your will is strong enough, you can prevail. So what happened with Savile in the protection that he had, and his involvement with the royal family, including Dickie Mountbatten or Edward Mountbatten, Lord Mountbatten, who introduced Jimmy Savile into the royal family, Prince Philip, Prince Charles. That's a whole thing. But what interested me, that I was researching a bit about Myra Hindley and Ian Brady. I don't know, I kind of always had an interest in ghoulish subjects, serial killers, and it turns out that that Savile was connected to the Yorkshire Ripper, and Myra Hindley and Ian Brady, and they were performing rituals on the Saddleworth Moors, where some of these children, were slaughtered. And it kind of, in a way, it came into my mind that there's another little trio here. There's Savile the alchemist, the wizard. There's Myra Hindley, the Scarlet Woman, the witch, and there's Brady, the alchemist. So even it goes back to Parsons, Hubbard, and the various female goddesses or muses they used, the squires, and then it goes back to again John Dee, Edward Kelly. These little triangles just came into me, and then of course what happened was that Savile's connections to Lord Longford, who via Hindley and Brady, and also conspiracy theories about the Yorkshire Ripper being under the mind control of Jimmy Savile are kind of interesting ones. Lord Longford was also the cousin of a woman called Harriet Harman, who was a Labour MP coming up to more recent times. Harriet Harman was involved with advocating under what's called the PIE, which is the Paedophile Information Exchange, which was actually founded at LSE, the London School of Economics, during the First World War, which I've spoken about with regards to the Fabian agendas. And of course, this is advocating that the age of consent should be reduced to 10. So Lord Longford connections, Jimmy Savile connections, Harriet Harman. Harriet Harman is also the cousin of David Cameron, who is also the cousin of Queen Elizabeth. So I was just looking at these connections the other day, and at that time, about 10 years ago, I was involved with doing some, I won't say, but I was involved with taboo art, which was art based on a lot of these subjects to do with sex and a bit of occultism and things like that. Not that I've ever gone into the dark side of it, but I got approached by someone who turned out to be a cousin of David Cameron and also a cousin of Queen Elizabeth, and they bought all my work. At the time, I thought nothing of it, and I thought, well, how come these members of the aristocracy are buying what then was my taboo and banned art? Because my art at that time was being banned, and of course the outlet I had was through this this weird network. And it only came to me the other day when I was looking back and thinking, then you get Savile, you get the Crowley. Savile was another person obsessed with Aleister Crowley's belief systems, and also then you get Stoke Mandeville, you get the Rothschild connection, you get the Tavistock Institute connection, and then you get coming up to more or less the 1960s, where I entered the scene and became very much immersed in the counterculture. So you're looking at a period of like probably only 30 years between what happened in the 60s, which then I had a lot of experiences with the people, a lot of people I've had connections with and experience with would have been very much part of this world, and this all started with my research into the world of the commune that came about in where I live now. So I'm not going to go into what happened in the 60s as yet, but there's certain things that happened that I then started researching, which kind of, the more you put the pieces into this jigsaw puzzle, the stranger it gets.
And in the next exciting episode, where are we going now?
Listen, what I'd like to talk about at some maybe not too distant stage is what happened with Operation Paperclip, because that is a natural lead on from what happened at the time, because at the time Parsons was doing this stuff. 46 was when Paperclip was being established, and it's not, there are severe links between, very profound links between the people that set up Paperclip, i.e. the CIA, and the Nazis, the 50,000 Nazi scientists, including Werner von Braun, that were brought over to establish the New World Order in America. A lot of it on the basis of Nazi belief systems that connect a bit into what Crowley was doing, and the concept of the Superman and AI and alien intelligence. And of course, that's a whole different story. And it's not just Werner von Braun. There's Goebbels, there's Mengele, there's the Bush family, who, I've followed research that suggests the Bush family were actually.
Well, the name escapes me, but the head of the space program was German scientist, part of that group.
Yeah.
And that was plasma physics.
Yes. Yeah, I've got all that information. It's something I've got all written down.
Interview by Michael Sala of a guy called Michael, I think David Adair.
Yeah.
Connects straight into Area 51.
Yes.
That special government area.
Yeah.
We weren't able to.
Yeah.
Penetrate.
Also, the Bush family were, in fact,
what's the real name of the Bush family?
Was the Scherf family, and how I got down to this particular rabbit hole, which I'm in at the moment, it's quite a dark one, but I saw a photograph in, I guess, around 1929, 1930 with the Scherf family, which is George Bush Senior and George Bush and Prescott Bush, who was George Bush Senior's father, who was actually became the head of the CIA, along with Joseph Mengele.
And the DVD.
Reinhard Gehlen, yeah, who then were pretty much Hitler's henchmen, and then they became.
And you talked about the World Economic Forum.
Yeah, all that. So that all leads on to this, but
that'll be the next exciting episode.
Yeah.
Of.
Yeah, I think I'd like to do something on that because it connects to all the other episodes as well in a kind of curious way, but yeah, I think people will find that quite interesting.
I think so. And thanks, Bob Osborne, for dropping in on a very wet late February Sunday afternoon. So until the next exciting episode, it's bye from me and...
It's bye from me.
And there's probably another whole history about that little phrase between two comedians, but we don't want to go into that.
I know.
Okay, thank you, Bob.
Pleasure.